Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. And after the announcement of possibly one of the most impactful items cards coming out of the GGN set in Japan, I thought it's worth looking over this card in a bit more detail because it will be a very impactful one that we have to get used to because it really is going to change the way the game is played since N was rotated. And now that we're getting this effect back into the game, it does impact a lot of things. So I feel like it's my duty to talk about this card and actually defend the card, because when it came out, a lot of people seemed to have a negative response to its release. And I'm very, very positive about the card. I think it's actually very necessary for the game. So let's talk about this reset stamp card in more detail. First of all, a quick reminder of what it does. It's an item card that says your opponent shuffles their hand into their deck, then your opponent draws a card for each of their remaining prize cards. So it is literally the N style effect for only your opponent, and it's an item card. So that's the intention. If your opponent gets ahead, you can try and reduce their hand size to have less outs to actually close out the game. That's the idea. First of all, let's talk about why we need hand disruption in Pokemon. It's so fundamental that a game like this genuinely does cry out for hand disruption from the opponent's side, because otherwise there's no comeback mechanic in the game. And we need to have this. Although, you know, hand disruption may not be the only way we can have comeback mechanics, this is the one that we're being given, basically. It's the one that we are most used to. And essentially, pretty much as you all know, Pokemon is normally won by taking 6 prizes, by knocking out your opponent's stuff. Taking a knockout gives you a lot of things all at once. You're getting closer to actually winning the game. You're getting additional card draw, sometimes multiple cards at once if you're knocking out GXs or tag teams. And these are previously like inaccessible cards outside of like Guzma and stuff. Not Guzma, what's it called? Gladion right now. And then there's also the fact that your opponent is losing stuff on their board. They have to, you know, attach more energy cards, find more tool cards, find all sorts of things on their turn just to rebuild their board or respond to your attacking Pokemon. Otherwise, your thing isn't being dealt with and you're just going to keep plowing ahead even further. So there really is a big snowball effect of Pokemon. It's just the nature of how prizes work. It's the nature of how knockouts work. As you start winning the game, the opponent has to spend more and more resources, whereas you're gaining more cards at the same time. Obviously, Pokemon is a back and forth. Oftentimes, the opponent will be able to respond, and you'll also be like spending cards the entire game. That's the sort of back and forth prize race that we see. But the person who strikes first is oftentimes just going to be way better off because they're getting everything as a benefit. There's no downside to going ahead in the game, especially right now. With no end in the format, there is no reason why you shouldn't take extra prize cards, because it's always going to be beneficial for you. It's an extra card in your hand to give you options. It's just incredible. So really, we've seen with no end in the game, aggressive decks have been reasonably able to dominate, and the only real hand disruption that we have so far in the format are in the form of the supporter card Judge, which is basically only seen in Zoroark because they can trade out of their own Judge because it only gives you a 4-card hand size. Pretty much every other deck doesn't play this unless they're going like heavy Judge Whistle or something like that. But overall, it's so detrimental to yourself that you never really want to do this on your own side, and it's sort of a risk. So only really Zoroark can get away with it right now, to good effect at least in top tier play. And also Marshadow. Marshadow hasn't really proven itself to be a comeback card, although if you are behind, you can let loose and maybe get back ahead. It's actually seen more play in aggressive decks, even further enhancing their lead, because you can take the first knockout, force the opponent to have this sort of rebuild and response phase where they have to try and get their next attacker rolling and have something to deal with your big threat, but you've also put them to a low hand size as well. So whilst you're getting this massive advantage, you're also putting your opponent further behind in, you know, how they can respond to you. And that's the whole idea. That's why we're seeing Marshadow allow you to snowball games, and sometimes if a let loose sticks for a turn or two, the game is instantly over because the opponent has just fallen too far behind and won't be able to catch up, because there are no catch-up mechanics in the game. Now we have this reset stamp. It's such a relief that you can actually get back into the game now, which is just incredible. So is this literally return of N? Let's compare it to this supporter card that was absolutely absurd. It was played as sometimes a 4 of in like a bunch of decks, pretty much the majority of decks when N was around, played 4 copies of this in everything. and we'll be comparing the stamp to N right now. So N was awesome because it struck a great balance between early game consistency, because it could draw you 6 cards in the early game, because you probably haven't taken prizes. Even like Shuffle and Draw 5 is a reasonable card. You know, Shuffle Draw 6 is Cynthia. That's currently our best supporter card in the format right now. Debatable with Erica as well. But N just doing the Cynthia style effect on turn 1 was always strong. So you liked having 4 copies of this in hand because it was always strong for you in the early turns, whilst also being the only way that you can get back into the game if you start falling behind to ruin your opponent's plans. Additionally, N was very, very searchable and reusable. It was in a format where we had Tapu Lele at times, and we had Versus Seeker to recycle it as well for the key turn that we needed to hurt our opponent's hand. So essentially, N was a card that you were always happy to see in your hand, no matter what turn you were in. Yes, maybe mid-game where you're just shuffling like both of you to 3 cards or whatever, it feels pretty weak. It's basically just the judge effect that we have. But in the early game, it's far superior, and in the late game, it's far superior. Just an incredible card overall. Obviously, the sort of downside to this card compared to Stamp is that you're using your supporter effect for turn, so it means that it's much more difficult to deal with your opponent's draw engine at the same time, or bench threats at the same time. It was basically only really things that played Bloodthirsty Eyes, Lycanroc, that could do that, because you're obviously using a Gust effect and a Hand Disruption effect at the same time. Stamp is obviously able to do this a lot more often, because you can play a Guzma alongside a Stamp. That's the big benefit of the Stamp compared to N. So you can do like an Acerola plus Stamp play to really force your opponent to have more cards to knock out like a new healthy threat, or you can Guzma and deal with their draw engine at the back. You can knock out like their Oranguru, their Jirachi, whatever else it is, or you can knock out something that they've been powering up in the back, and also put them to a low hand size at the same time. So that's where Stamp kind of trumps N, but it's also a far more situational card. If this is in your opening hand, or if it's in your hand at any time that isn't mid to late game, it's terrible for you. It's completely useless, really. Unless your opponent's hand size is like already like 10, 12, 13 cards, where the Stamp is still similar to like a red card. It's still like okay-ish. But that's only going to be specifically against Zoroark, or like Salazzle decks, I guess, as well. So it's only really good in the like early mid if the opponent's gone crazy with like Lily into Zoroark and started trading a bunch, or they've gone Salazzle crazy and started getting a big hand size. It's really only good in the mid to late game. That's all we're really looking at this Stamp for. Do bear in mind it's at least an insta-playable card, so if you were to see it in your opening hand, you could still just play it down for the sake of, you know, improving your own Lily. It's not like you can't play this unless your opponent only has like 3 prize cards remaining or less or whatever. So at the very least, it is technically insta-playable, but it's only very strong for you in the late game. So that's the thing to bear in mind. Also, it's a power card. Unlike N, it's not doing anything for yourself. It's not helping your own hand situation, not getting you out of a tight spot. So it's going to be about striking this balance between whether we want to have these cards that can hurt our opponent's hand, or more in our own deck that can help us draw optimally and make our plan A work more often. So this is, you know, in many ways similar to like a Choice Band. Choice Band just lets you do more damage, get more knockouts faster in the game. But it doesn't help you when you're dead drawing and bricking, and if you were to get hit off a Let Loose, you see a Stamp or you see a Choice Band, you're equally upset because it's not going to help you do anything. Whereas an N would at least, you know, let you shuffle and draw more cards. This isn't going to do that for you. It's not going to get you out of that bad situation. It's literally just trying to disrupt the opponents. It does have its own search and cycle options that we're going to look at in a second. So although N was very searchable and reusable, this card does have its own opportunities to do that as well. So it's kind of like equally searchable, I would say, overall. We have a lot of options right now in the TCG to get item cards out of our deck. So it seems to be searchable in a lot of good archetypes, and that's something that we'll be exploring next. So what are the decks that are going to be able to use this as best as possible? I think it may end up being similar to N in that it more or less does go into a bunch of decks, even if it is just a 1 or 2 copy type of card. But there will be decks that certainly play it, and these are the ones that can take the most advantage out of it. The likes of Salazzle and Zoroark based decks, because you can draw so many cards with Salazzle and Zoroark, you'll naturally have this in hand more often, so you'll be able to use it at the right times. Also, Zoroark in particular, it's just normally a 2-shot deck. It's more likely to fall behind and then catch up later down the line. A lower Ninetales can obviously Mysterious Guidance this card out alongside another item card. Maybe it could be even more disruption. Maybe it's things like Beast Ring that you could bear in mind. Things like Buzz Rock Tails was an archetype. Now you can use your Ninetales to get yourself Beast Ring and the Stamp at the same time. Really put your opponent on a clock because you're going to power up attackers out of nowhere and force the opponent into a low hand size situation. Jirachi is obviously incredible, mainly in Zapdos, but it can also see play in Malamar. That means that Malamar could also just play like one copy of the Stamp or two copies and have this disruption option. And Zapdos Jirachi is more than likely going to play it because they have like Volkners in the list anyway, so they can dig it out. Volkner essentially serving as an N at that point. There's also the Alolan, or no, not the Alolan, it's just a regular Persian GX that has the ability, when one of your GXs or EXs was knocked out, you get to search your deck for any 2 cards. Obviously, this has insane synergy because you've just received a knockout on your end, so your opponent's started to take prize cards. You can definitely go ahead and grab yourself a Stamp to reset their hand, and also maybe some other cards to help you get your Respond attacker going. Things like Power Draw and Smooth Over as well are extra ways that you can try and go for this. Maybe there's more emphasis on sort of Meganium Swampert-based builds because falling behind is much more beneficial now. We can actually catch up with Stamp, whereas previously you fall behind and you stay behind. That's pretty much how the game works. Now we have much more emphasis on recovery and stuff like that. We can claw our way back into the game once we've got our crazy setup going with 3 or 4 stage 2s in play. And we put our opponent's hand size to a low amount and we can just snowball with the likes of Super Boost Energy and such. I think Swampert's going to be a more relevant card when we have Nidoqueen with the boost energy as well, so definitely something worth talking about. Magcargo can obviously put something to the top of your deck, and you could Acrobike or trade or Judge's Whistle straight into that card as well, so that's definitely going to be a great way that you can grab your Stamp out of nowhere. There are currently a couple of supporter cards that can help you get there. I've already mentioned Volkner making Pikarom and Zapdos likely to play, I think, exactly 1 copy, because those decks are aggressive and they don't want to have too many Stamps in their own build, but it will still be a nice disruption option. And Green Search is a fantastic supporter card that sees a lot of play in Japan. It can go ahead and grab you 2 trainer cards if you just have no abilities in play, so this can help the sort of quad tag team based decks try and go for a Green Search. Do bear in mind, like, the decks that play Green Search are usually tag team based, so you'll only be stamping your opponent down to 3 cards. So it's basically just the same effect as a Judge or a Marshadow anyway, so it may not end up going into those tag team based builds, but I thought it would be worth mentioning just because Green Search is a really nice supporter card that can obviously grab this for you as well. Next up, there are some concerns about the card. It's not all rosy. I do accept that there are some ugly combinations that people have been theorizing and looking at already, and I think it's really looking at things like stall decks and more sort of hand disruption on top of the reset Stamp, similar to how like we saw red card delinquent based combos in Expanded and how that led eventually to a ban for the delinquent itself. Red card still remains in Expanded. It feels like reset Stamp might be one of these cards that can then trigger more effects in the same turn to put your opponent down to an unworkable hand size, which sounds very awkward. The likes of the new Honchkrow GX is definitely a problem card with its GX attack that can simply take 2 cards out of your opponent's hand of your choosing for a DCE on a stage 1. Very, very scary and awkward to deal with. There's also the potential for Lieutenant Surge to reuse 2 Mars in the same turn. If you put your opponent down to 2 cards in their hand with a reset Stamp, you can go Lieutenant Surge, double Mars them down to a 0-card hand. It feels like Pokemon actually now has a lot of ways you can put your opponent to 0 cards. Gardevoir and Sylveon Tag Team GX is a very, very popular archetype in Japan. Very successful as well. So we're going to have to start getting used to playing with no cards in our hand at times. It's genuinely a thing that could be happening in a lot of different ways now, which is scary and upsetting, but it kind of makes us have draw engines on the board, which I'm at least a fan of. Sylveon and Steven's Resolve based stall decks, they're always going to be able to find the reset Stamp whenever they want to. And the biggest fear about this is that basically the big downside of the stall decks right now is that they'll eventually have a turn where they can't have an instant response to a card. For example, they can Plumeria a certain amount of times, but they only play like 2 or 3 Plumerias, they only play 2 or 3 Acerolas, and eventually they have to break that chain by Lusamine back those cards. And that's where you can start gaining prizes against these sorts of stall decks, because they'll eventually, slip up on a turn and have to Lusamine rather than using an energy removal card or a healing card. And that's where you get your advantages. That's how these decks lose a lot of the time, outside of just let loose. And the fact that you can go for this reset stamp when these stall decks have already suffered a few knockouts, it means that they have much more time to just go, sweet, I can start Lusamine my stuff back now. I can Plumeria, Lusamine, Plumeria. And if they just have 2 or 3 turns of dead draw against stall, it gives them so much more safety. They can completely clear up those turns that they were behind. They get to Lusamine chain those that much more and stuff like that. So that's something I will be concerned about. At the same time, though, stall hates getting let loosed. And I think, even though they'll draw 6 cards, this card is potentially a death sentence for Mill, because it breaks Lusamine and Stevens loops, it breaks Magical Ribbon. So I think this is as strong as a card as it is for Mill. It's also very scary for them at the same time, because it's going to reset their hand so much more often. It's just going to naturally be in more decks. So I think people talking about Mill being a problem card alongside the reset stamp, I think it's fine, because we're naturally getting Welder and Fire decks, which have a lot of energy acceleration and recovery. So that's naturally going to be very strong against Mill. And we have Reset Stamp being naturally very strong against Mill. I think these things are actually going to help push Mill away from the format. So I think I'm more concerned about Honchkrow decks than I am Quad Sylveon or Hooper Walls or whatever. I think those are more hurt by Reset Stamp than they are helped. A few other things a lot of people have mentioned, just looking at initial reactions from the reveal of Reset Stamp. A lot of people have looked towards the new Miss Magius coming out in Unbroken Bonds. It simply lets you knock it out on your own turn, and you get to draw until you have 7 cards in your hand. It's okay. People are trying to use this to aggressively push your own prize, make your opponent take prizes, so you can just Reset Stamp them to a low hand size if they're not prepared for that sort of situation. But at the same time, it sort of acts as protection on your own end. So it is versatile. I think you always have to be careful about cards knocking themselves out. It's usually very, very detrimental to do that. As we know, the effect does have to be insane. But the fact that this Magius can, if you're ahead, you can just let this get knocked out to help you push over the line if you have been hit with a Reset Stamp. And if you're behind, you can push the opponent even more ahead and then Reset Stamp and hope that that gets you, your way back into the game. So I think because it has this now 2-way versatility, it's much more reasonable. And of course it has Duststone as well, so it has more synergy with the Honchkrow deck also to try and go for this Lusamine, the Surge Mars play. If you're going for early Miss Magius a few times to help you build towards this combo, it might be a sort of turbo empty your opponent's hand deck, which will be interesting to see, but I don't think it's going to be all that powerful. At the same time, Unfair is strong enough on its own that you don't need to reset your opponent's hand to that fewer cards. You can reset them to 3 or 4, and then just Unfair, the only 2 good cards they have, and it's still fine. But we can still do that with Let Loose. Regardless, I'm getting off topic. Guzma's the card that is also a concern. Guzma's obviously in every deck, and that also plays the things that play Reset Stamp lets you essentially do the thing that Zoro Rock and Buzz Rock were able to do, which was back in the day sort of gust up an Octillery, knock it out whilst also going for an end play. Now we can go for Guzma on anything plus the stamp, knock out their big threat, knock out their draw engine, and hope they get nothing. So if anything, it draws us more towards having even more draw support Pokemon. Maybe things like double Oranguru might be something we're seeing for Worlds. Maybe 3 or 4 Salazzle on boards rather than just one, using one, a turn, Roast Reveal a turn. Maybe we're going to see that a lot more often, just so that we always have protection against this Reset Stamp. I think the other thing that people are unhappy to see is the return of Garbotoxin plus N. I'm doing that in quotation marks because it's only for GXs and EXs that we can shut off, but at the same time, it is possible to put your opponent down to a 1 or 2 card hand size and stop them drawing cards via, Lele for their final support of a game, or trade to get them out of this awkward spot. So I think that Garb plus N combination does seem very scary, and one that decks are not going to be happy to come up against. Finally, let's talk about some general defenses that we can have against the Reset Stamp. I think, as I mentioned, it's incredible to have this in the game because it's a skill testing card. It makes people play very differently just knowing that this could happen to them at any time in the game. Obviously, the first thing that you think of is just having draw-based Pokemon on your board. Having more Jirachis, having Salazzles, Zoroarks, Orangarus, Zebstrikers, those are the ones that I mentioned earlier that help you find the stamp in the first place. They'll also defend you against opposing stamps, which is very good for you. It's like a twofold benefit for you having draw-based Pokemon on the board these days. Outside of that, the ways we can defend ourselves, having multiple attackers ready to go to respond simply on the board rather than on the hand. You can imagine things like Pikarom full blitzing to backup attackers. You can see Malamar decks play completely off the board because once their main attacker gets knocked out, they can Psychic Recharge more attackers ready to go. So these are big examples that they'll always have attackers ready to roll against you, even if they have no hand size. Also, playing cards from your hand simply to reduce the amount of cards that you have in your hand that will, be bad for you. So, like putting down choice bands even when you're up against non-GX decks. At the moment, there's not really a huge need to do that unless you know they play Let Loose or Judge. Whereas it's better for you just to hold it in hand, so it could be like a free Ultra Ball for you later down the line. Now you may just want to be more proactive in attaching those cards just in preparation for a reset stamp at any point. Also, there are those moments in games where you may not want to take prize cards, even if you have a knockout on board. Maybe you don't want to take that prize because your hand or board isn't ready to get reset stamped away. You may end up losing the game because of it, so you may choose to simply pass certain turns. If your win condition is to knock out a Tapu Lele, don't go down to 1 prize, just stay at 2 prizes. Stuff like that is things that people never really have to do currently in Standard, but it's going to be something that becomes more and more common when reset stamp is in the format. Finally, there's always the option of just hitting your opponent with a reset stamp before you get hit with your own, before they hit you with their own. So that's also going to be something to bear in mind. Stamp wars may end up being a thing where you want to get them, even if you're the one on more prizes, you just want to, on less prizes, you just want to get their stamp out of their hand, let them have less options so that you can just sort of coast to victory without getting disrupted. So that's also going to be a thing that will definitely happen and is possibly the strongest way that you can defend yourself from a reset stamp. It's by hitting them with one, especially if you're, neck and neck with prizes throughout the entire game. So in summary, I think this card is not similar to N in the fact that it won't be a 4-of in every deck. I do think it's an incredibly welcome addition to the game. I know there's a lot of hate from it. I've already seen so many posts on Facebook and even on my YouTube video from yesterday looking at the whole set. There's a lot of people say that this card is horrible for the game and really bad, but I really hope that today I helped shed some better light on the card as to why it's mandatory to have a card like this in the format. And why it will definitely make the game better and more skill testing at the same time. I think that's definitely a big takeaway. It adds more skill to the game, which I'm very happy to see because it was basically lost as soon as N rotated. People had to forget a lot of good practices in the game, and now that's going to help us play a little bit tighter throughout every single game that we play. Also, do note that some decks will be better at abusing this than others, and there's always going to be that question mark around certain decks, especially if they are aggressive, maybe, or if they simply just don't have the likes of Green Search, Zoroark, a lower Ninetales. If they're not playing these sorts of engines to grab your reset stamp at the right time, is it even worth playing it at all? Maybe it's not. Maybe it's worth you just committing more deck spaces to your own consistency supporters, your own consistency Pokemon, and other ways that you can defend against getting hit with a reset stamp. And the last thing that I do want to quickly note is that there are some concerns about combos with the reset stamp, but at the same time, this is going to be in a format where we have Gardevoir and Sylveon Tag Team GX, which can put you down to a zero card hand anyway. So even without reset stamp, we need to change the way we play the game anyway, because we're going to have to deal with zero card hands regardless, because it's already going to be present in the game because of that tag team. So I don't think reset stamp's the problem. I think it's a solution to many problems, and it's going to make the game overall a lot better. Let me know what you guys think down below. I'm sure this will spark a lot of debate. I've talked a lot about the reset stamp, and I'm honestly counting down the days till I can play this card, because it's going to make the game so much more fun, in my opinion. And it means that no longer do we just simply lose games because you missed an attachment turn 1 and you just fall behind and can't get back ahead. Now it removes that element of getting unlucky in the opening turns and still gives you a chance to get back into the game. and it also just makes you play better and rewards the more skillful player at the end of the day. So that's always something that we want out of a tactical and strategic card game. That's it for today, guys. Hope you did enjoy. I'll be back tomorrow for, I think, a collection video, so look forward to that. Cheers, and I'll see you then.